Thanks everyone so much for coming. My name is Michelle Matterr. I'm the Associate Director of the Bachelor's Program here at the New School for General Studies, as well as a faculty member in Media Studies and Film. And it's my pleasure and honor to introduce our program for this evening. I'm going to ask people at the food table to have a seat. I know you guys want to grab something quickly, but the idea was to have that for afterwards while we have the book signing going on. So we can do that too then. It's okay. It's okay.
The food will still be there.
For those of you, the food will still be here. Yes, the food will still be here, we promise. Those of you who are familiar with the New School know about our long and rich history and connection to social justice and civic engagement. So when my dear friend Millie Hawk Daniel from Policy Link approached me with the idea of doing this program, I said, but of course. And so did our executive dean, David Scobie, who is a great champion of public and cultural engagement and brings a lot of his work to his position as our new dean. I think tonight's program is going to be really special. I'm very thrilled to have friends and colleagues both on our panel, and I think we're in for a real treat. I'm going to introduce a little bit to you about Policy Link, and then I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Tracyann Williams, who's also a faculty member here in cultural studies and gender studies and literature. She's a great colleague and friend, and we do many programs like this together. Usually they have a film component and or a literature component, or both. So tonight we're having one half, and it's going to be interesting to hear your comments as well, and we want this to be an engaging and interactive discussion. So as you see, we have mics to the left and right, and that's what they're for. So Policy Link is a national research and action institute advancing economic and social equity by lifting up what works. I had the pleasure of attending a Policy Link conference about 3 years ago now, really, was it, in Los Angeles, the Black and Latino Summit, which was the first time there had ever been, do you believe this, a Black and Latino Summit, which was crazy, and it was wonderful. It was a great experience, and I hear it's going to be replicated this coming November in Detroit. So people get in the car or get on the plane and come on up to Detroit. Founded in 1999, Policy Link connects work of people on the ground to the creation of sustainable communities of opportunity that allow everyone to participate and prosper. Such communities offer access to quality jobs, affordable housing, good schools, transportation, and the benefits of healthy food and physical activity. And the discussion we're going to have tonight revolves around a new book written by Angela Glover Blackwell and Manuel, who are our other panelists. So I'm not going to talk anymore. I'm going to sit down, and I'm going to turn it over to Tracyann Williams. Tracyann?
I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank everybody for coming out. We are going to have, I think, a very fruitful and engaging discussion this evening. Before I ask a few questions of our panelists, I'm just going to introduce you to them very, very briefly. Angela Glover Blackwell is the founder and chief executive officer of Policy Link, and as Michelle told you, founded in 1999. Policy Link has become a leading voice in the movement to use public policy to improve access and opportunity for all low-income people and communities of color, particularly in the areas of housing, health, transportation, education, and infrastructure. And of course, to my immediate right, Manuel Pastor is professor of geography and American studies and ethnicity at USC. He's the founding director of the Center for Justice, Tolerance, and Community at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and he currently directs the Program for Environmental and Regional Equity at USC. Could you please join me in welcoming them now? So what I'm going to do is, for about 20 minutes or so, I'm going to engage my co-panelists, and then I'm going to open it up for questions from all of you. I'm sure that you're going to have questions. So the two mics are on either side. So I'll remind you that there are mics when the appropriate time comes so that you can ask your questions then. So for the purposes of our discussion tonight, I thought that it would be interesting for the folks in the audience who don't know you and don't know the project, for you to talk about your personal experiences and histories and how those brought you to the book project and also to the work that you do.
I'll start. Hello. So nice for all of you to come out for this. The book that we're talking about is Uncommon Common Ground, Race in America's Future. And it's the second installment of a book by a similar title. Manuel Pastor, Stuart Quo, and I were the authors of the first one and the authors of the second one. We wrote the first book at the invitation of the American Assembly. And the American Assembly is based at Columbia University. It's been around for over 50 years, and they wanted to have a book about race, and they asked the three of us if we would do it. We sat down, and we talked, and we came up with a great outline for the book. And then when we had finished the first draft, we asked ourselves, why isn't this as interesting as the conversation we had when we were putting it together? And we recognized...
By the way, this version of the book is much better, so...
Yeah, we recognized that it was because it didn't have the individual stories that we've been talking about in the conference room. And so we put our individual stories in it, and when we updated the book, the first one was Searching for the Uncommon Common Ground. This is the Uncommon Common Ground. The search is over. We found it. And so when we did the second book, we kept those stories in, because even though there are many things that are different, our stories didn't change, and we thought that they were important. My story is that I grew up in a segregated St. Louis, Missouri.
I think they're about to switch you to a different
Yeah,
one.
we're switching you over.
Oh, you know, I like this better, actually. That I grew up in a segregated St. Louis, Missouri in the 1950s and the early 60s. And I know from doing research, talking to my parents, interviewing people, that the racism there was harsh. But I will tell you, in my growing up, I didn't experience it, because I had the benefit of being surrounded by a group of caring adults that spent all of their time making sure that the children were protected from the sting and burn of racism. Part of their job was made easy because we lived in a completely segregated experience. The places where we played and prayed and went to school and volunteered were all black. They wanted more. They wanted to make sure that we got out and experienced the outdoor opera, the art museum, the zoo, the best that St. Louis had to offer. I recognized once I got away and looked back, because I will tell you that when I was there, I felt very watched, very constrained. But when I got out and looked back, I recognized that for black people growing up during that period and before and after, community was the scaffolding that allowed us to move up and reach our full potential, even as we were locked out of the mainstream. As I've gone on, I've done so many things. I've been an organizer, a public interest lawyer, a foundation executive, a community builder, a policy advocate. I tell people that I've had many jobs, but only one project: to do something about injustice in America and beyond. And in doing that work, because of the experience I had growing up, I have never forgotten that community matters. That's my story. What's yours?
Yeah, what's up with you? Let me say a few words about the origins of this book, and then a little bit about my own story as well. And when we were first asked to do this book, I think most people's reaction was, isn't that interesting, a book on race? And what they asked was an African American, a Latino, and an Asian to write a book together. And actually our first reaction was, hey, we're all Californians. And that we thought that that was very interesting, that you would ask a bunch of Californians, because in fact the demographic change that went on in California between 1980 and 2000 is the demographic change the U.S. is going through between 2000 and 2050. So we enthusiastically went and wrote the first book. We actually decided to write this second book on the day after Obama was elected, when we began reading headlines about how America was post-racial. And we thought, wait a minute, maybe we need to have a book that will talk about race in America's future and talk about the progress that's been made, but also talk about the challenges that are still there. And we thought that this book could be a platform because we recognize that it's very difficult to talk about race. White people feel like they might, if they're of goodwill, say the wrong thing. If they're of bad will, they're glad to say the wrong thing. And people of color feel uncomfortable talking about race because we don't want it to be the only prism through which our experience or individuality is seen. And so we need to create a context for people to have good and honest conversations to come to the uncommon common ground. My story, but I would mention, and Angela knows, that aside from the fact that you should buy this book, if you're not a reader, it's about to be made into a major motion picture. Part of the reason why I moved to LA was to negotiate the movie rights. Angela is going to be portrayed by Beyonce.
Very nice.
And we're talking some major box office there. And I was originally going to be portrayed by Antonio Banderas. I was very excited about that. Turns out it's George Lopez, which is still okay, but it's really not the same. So when we started to think about our stories, and I think there's a whole thing here about the story of self and how the story of self can become the story of us and the story of now. When I started to think about my story starts not with me, but like many other kids of immigrants, it starts with my father, who arrived in the United States in the 1930s with papers that were imperfect. When World War II came, he was given a choice. He was actually in New York, and he was given a choice between being deported or joining the U.S. Army. And he couldn't figure out what to do, so he gave a penny to my cousin Carlitos, who flipped it. The penny came up a particular way, and he put the penny in his pocket. He and the penny went to war. Both came back safe. And a generation later, his son is a full professor at the University of Southern California, which would be even more of an accomplishment if I had season football tickets, but still, it's really quite a journey. And I like to say, and we say in the book, that's a great story, it's an American story, and it's the wrong story. It's the wrong story because when you tell it that way, what it sounds like is a family and their ganas, what we say in Spanish, their individual desires to get ahead. But my dad in the 1930s had no papers, but he had a union, and it defended his rights. And when he came back from the GI Bill, when he came back from World War II, there was the GI Bill, and that allowed him to do two things. One is to buy a house in La Puente, what we now know is an inner-ring suburb. I only learned that from Angela last week. And also for him to go to a community college, a guy with a 6th grade education, and learn about electricity, and go from being a janitor to being an air conditioner repairman. And our family was then able to go from being poor to being working class. And I went to public schools in La Puente, and they were decent because we were investing in them. And I went as an undergraduate to the University of California, Santa Cruz, because there was affirmative action to take a chance on a kid like me that did not fit the typical profile of who was going to school at that time. And the major point of this book is that this is the American story. It is a story of individuals and their desires, and we can't get rid of that part of the story. And sometimes the left forgets it. But it's also a story about the public policies we put in place to make these dreams possible. And it's more deeply a story of the social movements that put those public policies in place. A labor movement that made sure that we had unions and the kind of legislation that made it possible to have unions. A veterans movement that made sure that there was a GI Bill. A civil rights movement that opened up places like La Puente by removing the racially restrictive covenants and created opportunities like affirmative action. And if we move back to this notion that the American story is about social movements, public policy, and our individual dreams, then we can really move back to something that I think will help move our political debate forward.
Well, thank you both. Both are inspiring stories and leads me to my next question, because you both kind of touched on leadership. And you talk about leadership a lot in the book. But I'd like to know, since we are in a post-racial moment, since Barack Obama is here in New York doing a symbolic visit to Ground Zero, Since the New York Times declared Obama elected president, this is the day after his election, Obama elected president, racial barrier falls, what kind of leadership do you think is required in order to advance the kinds of change that you put forth in the book?
That is the ultimate question, which is why we actually deal with it later in the book. But I am happy that you ask it at this point, because I think that sometimes when we get to it late in the discussion and late in the book, people haven't put everything they've heard within the context of leadership. And it really always is about leadership. The point that we try to make in this book is that we're not in a post-racial era. And we're not going to get to one until individuals and communities and policy and practice change. We talk about the progress that has been made, but then we spend a lot of time talking about the progress that has not been made. We look at the gaps that exist between the health that we want for all and where so many people who are Latino and African American and Native American are in terms of their health and well-being. We look at wealth, and the wealth gap is one of the saddest stories in America. Almost no progress has been made in that era, in that arena, in terms of the wealth of people who are white and the wealth of people who are not. We talk about jobs, we talk about housing, we talk about all of those issues, and make the point that so long as the people who are being left behind can be identified based on their race and ethnicity, we will have to depend on leadership. And what kind of leadership is that? It's the kind of leadership, can you hear me in the back? It is the kind of leadership that understands that it can't make something happen based on your status. I often ask people if you are familiar with Star Trek, Next Generation. And if you remember Captain Jean-Luc Picard, he would often say, make it so.
Okay, I'm going to do something a bit unorthodox. I have a voice disorder, which makes it difficult for me to project. So what I'm going to do is walk out here to answer that question. The voice disorder, by the way, is called spasmodic dysphonia. I could describe it to you, but the way it gets treated is through Botox, which is why I look so good. And I'm glad that's being recorded. So let me just say a couple of things about leadership. One actually is, it's very interesting because you know how demographers say they know the exact day something happened, like they go, the 300 millionth baby was born today. His name is Jose. Right? He lives in El Barrio. You're like, how did you know that, right? So on December 15th, 1999, California became majority minority, right? And what was interesting was I kept getting phone calls from reporters all day long. They were very nervous about it, asking lots of questions. I actually called Angela, and she told me the Jean-Luc Picard story. And I thought, well, that's interesting. But they kept calling me. And they were, well, we became majority minority. What's it mean? What's it mean? What's it mean? And finally said, very frustrated, I don't know. But we're having a salsa party at my house tonight to celebrate. In the spirit of the new California, everyone's invited. They just need to learn a new step. And that's a little bit about what we're doing, is learning a new step in terms of collaboration, in terms of working together, et cetera. And I want to say a couple things about that. One is to think about the difference, to think about what it means to really collaborate. We've raised this up a bit in the book. You know, when people speak about collaboration, they often have the image of, do you know that ride in Disneyland, It's a Small World After All? And like you're going down and all the kids are singing and everybody's happy, right? Now, collaboration, by the way, is not like that, right? And in fact, the best way to think about collaboration is as principled conflict. That is, people that you are in conflict with, but you've got some goals that you share, and you're trying to figure out how you can work together. And you're also trying to figure out how you can conflict in a principled way. So one of the things we spent some time talking about in the book a lot, and it was raised earlier, is Black Latino issues. And you do not get to working together if what you do is simply say, oh, same struggle, same fight, right? You get together by identifying different things. One story. When I got back to Los Angeles, I was asked to be part of a thing that happened in South LA that was being run by Scope, and it was the beginning of a campaign for green jobs. And they asked Karen Bass, who's now a congresswoman at that time, first African-American, she's about to become the first African-American female speaker of any state assembly. And she'd done a lot of work in South LA, and she and I went to go talk in the community about African Americans and Latinos coming together in economic agenda. And we talked about the history, et cetera, and the deindustrialization and the immigrant flows, et cetera. And then at the end of it, someone raised their hand and said, you know, I used to like Mexicans. I just don't like these new Mexicans. And then someone else raised their hand and they said, you know, the challenge is that these young African American males don't want to work and the immigrants are coming in. You know what? That was the best conversation. It wasn't polite, right? It wasn't like what happens in universities. It wasn't like what happens in philanthropy. It was honest about the differences, the conflicts, and the tensions that were there. And out of that came a campaign for green jobs, which led to a retrofit ordinance in the city of Los Angeles to retrofit municipal buildings and create pipelines for African American and Latino youth to be part of the apprenticeship programs. Collaboration is principled conflict. Second thing I would say is for us to think about the difference between transactions and transformations. People spend a lot of time thinking about saying that leadership is making a deal. Did I get just enough votes to pass the thing? Instead of, was I able to create a leadership experience that transformed people in a fundamental way, which allowed them to pivot from their own issues to other people's issues and to begin to understand that they need to show up for each other. For example, moving back to the same thing, when we talk about African Americans and Latinos coming together, particularly around immigration issues, the usual way that that's talked about is how can we make sure that blacks support immigrants on immigration reform? The way I like to talk about it is how do we educate immigrants that African Americans have been at the heart of social justice struggles in the United States, and unless we make that a key part of immigrants showing up on those struggles, it's hard to expect solidarity. We need transformations, not transactions.
Both of you mentioned demographics as part of your answer about leadership, and you have a very compelling quote. Quite honestly, the book is compelling, so I'm literally just pulling out and picking and choosing. So I thoroughly recommend the book. But let me just say that there's an early quote where you say minorities constitute a much larger share of the young than they do the old, and I felt like that was stunning in terms of thinking about demographic shifts, but also the aging baby boomer population and what that means long term for the United States. So I wondered if you might talk about that, and also what your interpretations of the census has given to your research and to the work that you're doing now. Huge question, I know.
It's a huge question, and we both have lots to say about it. I'll start, but I'm sure Manuel is going to want to jump in on it as well. We really are a rapidly changing nation, and we're changing more rapidly than we know. We're changing more rapidly than we know. The census, and some of you may have been following this as it's been coming out, we now know that 46.5% of all children under 18 in this country are children of color. And we expect that by around 2019, the majority of children in this country will be children of color. We have been saying for some time that by 2050 we become a nation in which the majority of people are people of color. Then we started saying 2042, and I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if it didn't happen a little sooner than that. This is not just that we are becoming a nation in which the majority of people are people of color. It's different among different age groups. Already, right now, 80% of those who are elderly are white. You just heard me say 46.5% of those under 18 are children of color. In California, Manuel mentioned California earlier, 60% of those over 65 are white, and 70% of those under 18 are of color. We have for too long, in fact, our inability to deal with race or to deal with it in a way that is fair predates the founding of the country. So forever, we have not dealt fairly with race. We still are not talking about it. We are not struggling with it. We are not acknowledging it the way that we should. And so we have all these children of color, all these young people of color, for whom the nation seems prepared to pull up the ladder. I don't believe that we are a pull up the ladder nation, but that seems to be the way that we're headed. People don't seem to be prepared to invest in public education. They're not prepared to invest in health or job readiness or making sure that every community is a community of opportunity. What it seems that we've come to is that our racial divide has become a generational divide. So that if you are a young white family trying to make your home in the city, hoping to use public education, you're going to have a difficult time sending your white children to a public school because our racial divide has become a generational divide. If you're a young white community age student and you would like to use your community college to be able to get you ready to enter the health profession, you're going to find that the seats are dwindling, the cost is going up, it's not available to you because we've pulled up the ladder. And our racial divide has become a generational divide. And so as we think about how we're going to respond to the changing demographics, we can't just say, well, you know, we've got ours, they'll get theirs. They are you. We are they. We are one. We are completely bound up together. And we've got to figure out how to use that kind of leadership that we were just talking about to allow for a different conversation, different policies, different outcomes, because we have come to the conclusion that if we don't develop strategies that allow us to keep that ladder down and keep investing in everyone and keep a steady flow of future generations coming, the future for the nation is not bright.
Well, Angela said almost everything that needs to be said. But since I'm an academic, let me add a few things. So there are a couple interesting things about the census, and then I want to get back to the issue that she's mentioning. So between 2000 and 2010, the growth rate for Latinos was 43%. For Asians, it was 43%. For African Americans, 11%. For whites, about 1%. Basically flat in terms of the population. We gained 4.3 million Latino children, 700,000 Asian children. We lost the population, we didn't lose them, they didn't pass away, but the population of young whites below the age of 18 fell by 4.3 million, and the population of African Americans, again below the age of 18, fell by about 250,000. So the big change is happening in this Latino and Asian group. When people hear that, the immediate thing they think is that it's immigration. But one thing that's happened is the immigration flows into the country have been tapering down even before the recession and even before the increase in enforcement, simply because there's development going on in developing countries, less people are wanting to leave, et cetera. And we've been seeing this first in California. I know when people think about California, they think, gosh, this really heavily immigrant state. Our share of immigrants has been on the decline for the last couple of years in terms of the percent of the population that's foreign born. And Los Angeles is the only metropolitan area, major metropolitan area in the United States in which the number of Hispanic children fell between 2000 and 2010. So we're actually getting into a much more mature second and third generation, lower population growth, which is actually, although people are shocked by the 43% figure, this is actually tapering off from the growth rates in the 80s and the 90s for Latinos and Asians. And these are, as Angela mentioned, our children, quite literally my children, but our children. Now, Angela mentioned this generation gap. In the new census, the median age for whites was 41 years. The median age for Asian Americans, 35 years. The median age for African Americans, 32 years. The median age for Latinos, 27. 41, 27. That is nearly an entire generation in terms of the difference. And the generation gap that Angela points to, I know you might think, this may be some fantasy these folks are making up about some disconnection between people. If you take the demographic generation gap and you look at the level of state spending on the future, state per person or per capita capital spending, in those states where the gap is the largest, the state spending on the future is the lowest. Mm-hmm. One other thing to just drive this in, of the 100 largest metropolitan areas in the United States, metro areas like New York or Newark or Austin, Texas, or Minneapolis, St. Paul, which metropolitan area in the United States do you think has the largest demographic generation gap? The whitest old, the brownest young? I think Teresa's cheated. It's Phoenix. And is it any wonder, right? That Phoenix is blowing up around immigration issues, struggles around ethnic studies in the schools, and a number of other things. The second, by the way, is Tucson, which is another place in Arizona. So what we need to do is to understand that this is real. When people see that famous sign that was associated with the Tea Party about keep your government hands off my Medicare, and a lot of us laughed at it, the irrationality of somebody who was really getting government benefits saying, gosh, the government shouldn't be involved. The deeper thing about that is exactly what Angela was saying. Lift up the drawbridges just as a new generation is arriving. And that is exactly the point in the Paul Ryan budget plan, right? Which is that you'll be okay. You're over the age of 55. We got your back covered. But all these other people coming up, we don't got their back covered because they're not like you. And until we understand that we need to both grapple with the anxiety this older generation is having, both about their own security and about the demographic change in the country, which causes discomfort for them about what's happening to their country. And until we really make the country one, we're really going to be underinvesting not just in youth of color, but in all youth and in the future of the country.
I mean, both of your answers remind me of a quote in the book where you say that Americans are part of the same social fabric, and that's something that we've moved away from completely. So I'd like to talk about the title of the book, because we're dancing around the title, Uncommon Common Ground. And I'd like for you to explain to the audience, what do you mean by this thought-provoking phrase, and how does that help us to get to these difficult and uncomfortable conversations about race that you're suggesting we need to have?
That title, let me start differently. We've already explained it. Everything that we have said to you, we have been talking about that title. It's the title that we used in the first book, Searching for the Uncommon Common Ground. This one, The Uncommon Common Ground. The point that we're trying to make is that too often when we decide we're going to try to work together and be together and form those not really lasting or sustainable coalitions and collaborations, we try to find the least common denominator. We find the thing, well, at least we can all agree on this. So let's make that our platform. And then everybody comes together, you do the event, you have the march, whatever it might be. And it doesn't transform us. We feel that the transformation that we need requires for us to stretch. We have to find the highest points of agreement. We have to figure out how to be able to define our challenge in a way that includes all of us, but requires all of us to step up. I was given a speech about that, about the time we were writing the first book, and didn't use that word. I actually used common ground because it was the language that I had. And at the end of my speech, someone from the audience came up to me and said, you know, what you're talking about is not common ground, it's uncommon common ground. I mentioned that to Manuel and Stuart, and when we were searching for the name of the book, we said, let's call it that. And talking about uncommon common ground, we actually think, Manuel and I think this, and Stuart thinks it, and lots of people are coming to think it, that the uncommon common ground for the nation right now is to figure out how to deal with our deepest challenges in a way that we actually create more inclusion, that we deal with equity. That when you think about what the challenges are for the nation, we have to do something about the shrinking, the vulnerable middle class. The thing that has made this nation strong is its strong middle class. And it is vulnerable now. And when you think about who's going to be that middle class, the demographic data that we've been laying out makes it very clear that for this nation to have a middle class, we're going to have to invest in a lot of people that we have been disinvesting in. We're going to have to close those gaps in education and health, et cetera. That as we think about a middle class, we're also thinking about a vibrant 21st century economy. And to have a vibrant 21st century economy where we're tapping our own workforce and we're building things and we're setting out what it means to be in the global economy, that means that the very people who are being left behind have to become a workforce. They have to be prepared. And when we think about climate change and what we have to do to deal with climate change, we have to deal with transportation. We have to get people using public transportation. We have to start using our built environment. The very communities that we've been throwing away, we have to move back to. And we're not going to do that if the schools are failing, if there are no grocery stores, if there are no parks, if they're not safe. It means that the agenda that we have been pushing for, from an equity perspective, becomes an important agenda for the nation. So that when you think about what's the uncommon common ground, it takes a notion like equity, just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate and prosper. And it moves it away from being a demand from special interest groups, moves it away from just a discussion about what's the moral thing to do in a nation that claims to be morally strong. Equity becomes the superior growth model for the nation. It's by investing in equity that we create a strong middle class, that we create a workforce for a 21st century economy, that we make the policy changes that we need to deal with climate change. We think that's the uncommon common ground that allows people who've been struggling for years to put their case forward and allows others who have just been thinking about how do we improve the nation to realize that you don't improve the nation unless you deal with equity.
So what I would add to that is that we are hopeful, but we are not naive. We understand both the political forces that are arrayed against such a vision, and while we talk about restoring the American social fabric, there's all sorts of documentation in the book about the history of discrimination and Jim Crow and slavery and anti-immigrant sentiment. But the point that we're trying to make is that each of those has been met with a movement for liberation and social justice. And all of those difficult parts of our history have been met with more hopeful parts of our history that have tried to change things. And I think both of us have been playing a little bit with a concept recently that's relevant to that, which is about the politics of anger and the politics of aspiration. You know, we have in this country a very vibrant politics of anger. We see it in the Tea Party. We see it in the doubt about whether Barack Obama was even born in the United States. God, this is the city that hosts Donald Trump. Thank you. And what's interesting about that is that there's a tendency for those who are progressives to try to respond with an equal sort of tit-for-tat politics of anger, right? That for every Glenn Beck, we must have a Keith Olbermann, that we must have a politics of anger and sniping that responds in the same way that it's coming at progressive forces. And I think one thing that's really interesting about this demographic change is that just might not work. And the reason it doesn't is that for this older, whiter, feeling lost and anxious electorate, kind of works. But for this younger electorate of color, it doesn't work. I mean, you go out and do the polling, young African Americans and Latinos are more hopeful than everybody else. They have no reason to be, right? But they're much more hopeful, and they are much more hopeful. They were inspired not just by their own aspirations that they can get ahead, but their aspirations that they can build a better society and reconnect with people. And what's very interesting about this is that, and it means that we have to be a lot more patient, it's why we have an optimistic tone, is that we cannot meet this politics of anger with an equal politics of anger. Now, we got to be smart, we got to be strategic, you got to know who's against you. But we need to meet it with a politics of aspiration, a politics of how we can make this country a better place, of how everybody is actually essential to being part of that, because that's what's going to capture the energy of this younger generation and motivate them the way that the Obama campaign did. They were not motivated by anger. They were motivated by hope. They were not motivated by finger pointing. They were motivated by the possibility of connection. They were not motivated by enmity. They were motivated by community. And that is how we move people forward.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent place to stop for now and open it up for some questions from the audience. So if you would approach either of the two mics, please.
It seemed to be the bravest person in here. I was very inspired by every word I heard tonight. I just wanted to throw in a little aside that there's a new group that's needs to be included in this, and that's Muslims. There's so much discrimination against Muslims, and it's growing. I'm just throwing it in for the record.
And thank you for saying it. We absolutely agree. And when I read on what was on page 245 and talked about how you have to have everybody's back, I'm happy to call that out too. It is so true. And it is so easy to leave somebody out. And the person that you don't mention always feels so forgotten and so isolated. I can't tell you how many times I have experienced it myself. And so I always try, but there's always someone else to call out. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nina Kennedy. I did a documentary film on the Fisk Jubilee Singers, the first group of African slaves who returned to Europe after the Civil War and sang for Queen Victoria, and are the reason that Nashville is called Music City today, because Queen Victoria proclaimed they sing so beautifully, they must be from the Music City. And I just need to throw this out here. I just returned from Nashville, which is more segregated than ever. And I want to bring the conversation specifically to those of us who are descendants of slaves. Because I got to tell you, this now with Barack Obama in the White House, this is the first time I'm feeling like this is my country. First time I'm calling it my country. And when you're dealing with generations of people carrying that rage in their bellies from being descended from slaves, how to take the first step to overcome this when our warrior class is sitting in prison?
We lift up 5 or 6 issues that we think are the salient issues in the 21st century as they have to do with race. And one of them is imprisonment and reintegration. The whole notion of doing something about the extraordinary incarceration, period. I could just put a period there because this is the country that incarcerates more than any other. But then I will go on to add, and particularly people of color, and particularly African Americans and Latinos, and the shock, if you really look at the data, is the growing number of women, African American in particular, but also Latino in the prison population, and how we're doing nothing to bring people back into democratic participation in terms of voting, into being part of the community, all of those things. I actually often talk about it as this incarceration has created a legacy of absence in our communities. What does it mean when you take the men out of a community? What does it leave? What does it do? So we lift that up as an issue. We talk about being outspoken and fighting to try to stop it, and to make sure that when people are coming out, that we say to them, we know your name, we know what you did, and we need you. And we need to help you come back because we need you to be part of community. I thank you for raising that issue. I want to say something about Descendants of Slaves, because I was talking to my grandson about slavery, and I told him something that must have made him think that I am 200 years old. He looked at me like, could this be? I told him that I once met a person who had been a slave. And as I recalled this, he just could not believe it, because slavery is something so long ago. But my mother grew up in a house next to a woman who was old when my mother was a girl, who had been a slave. And when I was a little girl, my mother took me and I met Ma Tola. Now, I didn't ask her about slavery. I didn't even understand it. But when my mother later told me that Ma Tola had been a slave, I have always held on to every second that I can remember of sitting on Ma Tola's porch and what she looked like, and because I wish I had known more and could have interviewed her. We have to help the generation today to understand slavery, what it did, and that the fact that we are still recovering from it is not whining. It is not playing the race card. If I knew somebody who was a slave, and I am not ancient, it was not that long ago. It was not that long ago. And we have to help people to understand that. I thank you for your question.
You know, if I might just add one thing to that really great question. We have 5%, a little bit less than 5% of the world's population. We have 1/4 of the world's prisoners. The incarceration rate for African Americans is extraordinary. Latinos, it's higher than whites, but it's much higher than even for Latinos. And probably 15 to 20% of African American men of working age, prime working age, have been somehow entangled with the criminal justice system, and it affects their job. And Deborah Pager, I think is her last name, did a great statistical study in which she showed that a white male with a criminal record had a better probability of getting a job interview than a black male with no criminal record. So imagine what happens if you're African American and you have a criminal record. This is a huge issue. And it's one that people tend to think of as being a very isolated issue and affects a very particular population. One thing that we've had some success with recently is beginning to try to connect the over-incarceration and criminalization issues with the deportation of immigrants and the disruption of families, and helping to get immigrants in particular to understand the crisis in that light, and getting African Americans deeply affected by the crisis of over-incarceration to realize the threat to family continuity and community stability that this really egregious enforcement of pretty irrational immigration laws has imposed on communities that are living side by side. And I think making, I don't know where the person of history made the point is, but I think making the point so others can really get to it and understand how important it is very good, very good. So thank you for making the point.
And you probably all know it, but I can't recommend enough the new Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. Yeah. Excellent book. Lays out statistics as well as what to do about it.
Good evening. My name is Rosie Grant, and I'm always affected when I hear the term minority majority. It just seems to me as if it contradicts itself. So I wanted to see if you had any response to that. I also am affected by white and non-white, because that kind of sets white as the standard and everybody else is other. And I heard the term minority majority. I didn't hear white and non-white, but to me they sort of go together. And I wanted to see how you respond to that.
Well, it's funny because actually, and I didn't do it, but usually when I talk about demographic change and becoming quote-unquote majority, I say quote-unquote majority minority, or as I like to think of it, all minority all the time. Because really, and that's the point that I think Angela was making about minoritarian politics, right? Which is that if you are a minority, and I literally mean this of whatever type, right? You wind up having to practice the politics of coalition, right? Understanding what it is to move not just people who are already with you, but people who might be with you, and where can you find the ground where you can come together. So I think the point is well made. I would say also that we are, even in the book, somewhat trapped by the way that we've collected statistics in the past, right? And so some of that language continues to emerge. One thing that's really interesting, though, and this came out in the last census too, that it may be surprising, there has been a lot of thought that more people will be adopting the multi-race category, but it hasn't really been happening. It hasn't really changed that much. And I think it's for a couple of different reasons. One is, of course, that the way the society treats you if you're multiracial, but black, right? You're black, right? And the second is the following thing, which people don't think about it a lot. There's a great cartoon by a guy named Lalo, who's a Chicano cartoonist. I almost said that in Spanish. Cartunista. A Chicano cartoonist. And he's got this cartoon. It's great. It's this like sort of like the Jetsons in the future, and it says sort of the year 2100, right? And there's like little homes up in the air and flying saucers going around. There's two guys at the bottom, and one guy says to the other, "Geez, I wonder how everybody got along before everybody became Latino." And the joke there is, of course, partly about population growth, but the underlying joke, which most people in the Latino community get, is that Latinos think about race differently, right? They think, okay, you're white, you're black, you're Latino, and they think about Latino in a different way, and that way in which we Latinos, which is, by the way, not to be, again, naive. There's racism in the Latino community. There's racism in Latin America. Color makes a difference, etc. But that is not to dispute that Latinos think about race differently, and that some of that thinking about mestizaje, mixing, and the ability to call on many different cultures as being part of who you are is part of who we need to become as Americans. Be able to call on the many different parts of ourselves to realize ourselves.
The only thing I want to add to that is that I struggle a lot with language. I love words. Language is important to me. I love to communicate, so I try to find the simple ways to say something that allow the other to hear it. I often find that the thing about language that allows the other person to hear it is to allow them to see themselves in what you're talking about. And so the question that was raised about minority, majority, and non-white, you're right, I don't think we use the term non-white. I probably don't use it because I know a lot of people of color feel marginalized by it. But you also heard that when I talked about the racial divide has become a generational divide, I consciously included white people in the discussion. Because I don't want to have this discussion as just a discussion among people of color about people of color. Because I don't think that we solve our problem in a way that is sustainable and just unless we're all involved in solving it and we can all see ourselves in the solution. I really do think this notion of stretching to force ourselves to reach a high point, an inclusive point, is what we have to do. And so I just want to encourage us all to think about language, because sometimes it's so easy to talk in shorthand, and your shorthand may have helped you to communicate it quickly in your mind, but you lost the very person you wanted to hear it. I don't like reducing things to sound bites, because I think that the sound bite is likely to be too simple to actually capture what I meant and be big enough for people to see themselves in it. I just thank the person who raised it, getting us think about how we talk about this, because if we're serious about the uncommon common ground, it's going to require some uncommon language.
We're going to come over here, and then we're going to have the final two questions after you.
Well, thank you very much for your project. I mean, I think it's fairly clear that in spite of the terms that need to be used here about race, that you are striving for a philosophy for the common good. And I think in that case, it's something that anybody can really buy into. Really, my question or comment really dovetails with the previous question, which is beyond terminology. It has to do with experience. And in this society, when we talk about race, we have to talk about class, we have to talk about privilege, because class and privilege transcend race. And I hear a lot of criticism against Obama that he doesn't identify as a black man enough, but we have to see that it's more complicated than that. That we have to see what the experiences were that made us, even within our groups. We may not be able to have a common understanding or strive for the same things because of privilege. And when we're talking about these demographic shifts, the anxieties are not just with the elders and the values of this culture and this society, but for those who are afraid that in a capitalist society that they're going to lose all that they have. And I think it's important to integrate that into the conversation of race.
So I'll say a word about anxiety and then a word about capitalism. Yeah. So there's a great joke. Angela's heard me tell it before. She actually heard almost all my jokes, but she's so pleasant, she laughs. But it's a great joke by a comic named Paul Rodriguez. And he talks about being in Los Angeles, and the elevator opens up, and into the elevator come a number of Chinese guys. They start speaking Chinese, and he's kind of uncomfortable because he doesn't understand what's going on, and he gets just more and more anxious as it goes up, and finally the door opens up, and he gets out and he looks at them. He says, "My God, don't you know you're in the United States now? Speak Spanish." So there's a lot of anxiety on everybody's part about this change. And there's a lot of anxiety about giving up privilege. But giving up privilege is kind of the step toward empowerment. If you think about it, the way I would relate to it is, as a man, learning to give up as much privilege as you can as a man gets you to a closer understanding of women and who they are, and more egalitarian and better and richer relationships, right? So I think we don't realize that the more we give up, the more we get. And I think that one of the things that's kind of interesting, it's something that Angela and I have been working on quite a bit, is this shorthand bumper sticker, is equities, this barrier growth model. But it's actually something about the fact that there's an emerging bit of evidence, both at the international level and at the regional level, that countries that are more equitable grow more rapidly, and regions that are more equitable, that have lower levels of racial segregation, lower pockets of poverty, et cetera, they actually grow more rapidly and sustainably over time. And it's not just us. This is studies done by the Cleveland Federal Reserve. There's just a brand new study on growth spells in the developing world that's done by Andrew Berg at the IMF, right? So you don't have to believe the leftist professor up here at the New School, right? It's the Cleveland Fed and the International Monetary Fund. And the reason is it's a little bit like how we've recognized that hurting the environment's actually bad for economic growth. Mm-hmm. If you start to think about what's the best way to organize a business, right? It's to treat your employees fairly, to treat your customers fairly, to treat your suppliers fairly, so you can have sustained relationships over time. If you think about the one airline company that hasn't lost money, Southwest, and them workers are happy there, and they're unionized, right? And they actually have an ethic in there that says, the customer's not always right. Often it's the worker, right? Maybe it made sense to simply exploit people, but it really doesn't make sense any longer. Maybe it made sense to have a surplus population of so many people in prison to dampen down wages. It doesn't make any sense any longer in a knowledge-based economy to be losing that many people and leaving them on one side. Something has fundamentally changed. And I think progressives haven't picked up enough on it themselves. They still think about redistribution as just being something nice you do, right? Instead of something you do to generate participation, inclusion, and economic growth. Something is changing, and we are struggling with articulating that because we think that if we can articulate that better, we can build a very different kind of economy. Capitalism has shifted.
Hi, my name is Nin. First, I want to just thank you guys for creating the space and talking about it, and I really appreciated just hearing what you guys had to say. I also wanted to lift up two things about how I identify that might kind of shed light on where my question is coming from. So I wanted to highlight the fact that I'm 22, so I'm a young person, and I think I'm coming up in a very different context in terms of my relationship to race, and also that I'm an immigrant, so I wasn't born here. So that means that I've walked into a country, kind of inherited the history, and I've grown up, kind of negotiating my role in this history and how this history is changing. And what I've experienced in spaces like this, or just conversations with my friends, or in community group discussions about race, is that for me, coming with my identity as an Asian American, the barriers to inclusion include things like just the invisibilization of our history, and also this myth of the model minority, and kind of this misunderstanding about where Asians lie on that spectrum in terms of are we allies, are we in solidarity, are we a frontline community, and kind of where we are along that spectrum. And so I guess I wanted to see what you guys had to say about just that dynamic and confronting it, just straight on, and wondering if you had experiences dealing with that in a space to really just talk about what that means and breaking down those barriers.
So sorry Stuart Quo is not here. Stuart Quo, the other author of the book, he tells great stories. He's one of the most eloquent people on leadership, and so you'll have to figure out a way to have him back because you're not getting the whole sense of it with Stuart not being here. I want to say a little bit about this, and I hope that Manuel will speak to it as well. I think the main thing that we have to do is really understand everybody's journey and everybody's circumstance. Your own experience is your own experience. And I often put the burden on myself to let people know that if I am in the room, to know that I am struggling to have everybody's back. But I fail every day because no matter how hard I try, I don't have everybody's experience. I don't know everything that they're going through. I don't get treated the same way that they get treated. And the result of that is that we often miss the thing that is most important. That as we talk about people who are being left behind, there's also being left out. Sometimes to be left out is not the same as being left behind. That sometimes that when we start talking about who's being left behind and we give the data about what's happening with Native Americans and what's happening with Latinos and what's happening with African Americans, we'll often then say, and what's happening with some Asian groups. And we'll try to pull out the ones that have the same profile as what it is that we identify with Latinos and Native Americans and African Americans, and just leave out whole portions of people who are also going through isolation, trying to figure out how to be part of the struggle, trying to think about how to distinguish themselves even as they have things in common. And so I'm going to talk at your question rather than being able to answer it, because I think your question is a fundamental one that we all have to face. If Stuart had been here and he had told his story, the story that he would tell, which is so interesting to me, is that Stuart tells the story of being part of the civil rights struggle in the South. He was one of those who was in the South doing the whole effort to be part of that civil rights movement. And he and some of his friends stopped to have breakfast in a diner. And the waitress, who was white, came up to the group. He was the only person there who was Chinese American, and said to him, "Where are you from?" And Stuart tells a story, I won't get it exactly right, but it's something like this. He says, "Well, my grandfather was from Stockton, and my mother was born in LA, and he goes on like that. And before he finishes his story, and he's been going back, maybe it was a great-grandfather, the person says to him, "So how do you like your new country?" And every time Stuart tells that story, it just stands out for me. I mean, you see and you make a conclusion and you don't hear a thing that is said. And so what I take from your question is that we still have to figure out how to be in solidarity. How to be in solidarity for everybody who's got skin in this game. And people have skin in this game even when it isn't so obvious that they do. We have a long way to go, but I hope that you will say something about it as well, Manuel.
Yeah, the thing I'm going to say about it might be a little bit unexpected, though. So first, I really think this way in which Asians are viewed as the permanent foreigner, the permanent other, right, is really very deep. And that's exactly what Stuart's story tells. And then Angela was talking about kind of when you're in the room and in conversation and bringing your own story forward. I'll kind of start from a different point. Let me tell the story, and then I'll make the point of the story. So when I was in graduate school, I was in Amherst, Massachusetts, and I lived in Northampton, Massachusetts, Smith College. I had a very big lesbian community, and some of our housemates were lesbians, and there was a big march for gay rights. And some folks asked me to be, this is pretty early in the gay rights movement, asked me to be one of the sort of basically bodyguards for the march, right? And so I did that. And what was very interesting was that I used to play basketball at Northampton, street ball, because I thought I was a stud. It was totally inaccurate, and I wrecked my knee, and it was really a mess. But anyway, I played street ball. And I remember going down the street, and all the people that I played basketball with, all these tough guys, said, they were just freaked out, right? Because Manuel is gay, right? So then a week later, get to the court, right? And they were like, "Well, what were you doing there?" I was like, "At the march." And I had a chance for a year to play basketball as a gay man. Until one day, I was coming out of a bank, and my wife and I had done a transaction, and I gave her a big kiss, and this guy came up to me and went, "You're not gay!" But he played basketball with me for a gay. He had to get used to playing with a gay guy, which they were just totally uncomfortable with. Sometimes we have to speak as though the other is in the room, even if they're not there. If you're in a group of African Americans, and they are saying stuff about immigrants that's not paying any attention to the immigrant experience, or, man, them Asians are getting off easy, without understanding the tensions that may be faced in those communities and the diversity in those communities, got to say something. If you're in a group of Latinos and people are saying, geez, 43% growth rate for Latinos, 11% for African Americans, we're going to get it over on them. You got to say something. If you're in a group of white people and they are talking in a way that reflects some point where you can bring some education, you got to bring it up. You got to speak as though the other is in the room. And if we speak as though the other is in the room, then we will continue to make those rooms bigger, those tables more inclusive, because everybody will begin to be thinking about everybody in terms of policy, in terms of politics, in terms of conversation.
Let's have our last question.
Good evening, Starita Ansari. In the work that you're doing, do you see a role for places of worship? And if you do see a role, what is that role?
Oh, absolutely, yes, because I see a role for everybody, for every institution, and I think that places of worship, I think that faith institutions have a huge role. One of the things that I do often in the summer, because I am on the board of the Children's Defense Fund, and Marion Wright Edelman every summer has the Samuel Proctor Institute at Haley Farm, and she very cleverly has a board meeting at the same time of the Institute to get us all there to experience the Institute as well as do the board meeting. And so I get an opportunity to go and hear some of the great preachers of the nation talk about social justice as it relates to children. And I will admit to you that I don't go to a faith institution, so I don't go to church on Sunday and I don't do anything else like that. But when I am there at Haley Farm, I have an understanding of the power of faith leaders and of faith institutions to not only be places of fellowship, be places where you have a network that you can be a part of, but every summer when I am there, I never get through without weeping. I never get through it without feeling connected to something larger than myself. And I always leave completely charged up to stay on my journey around social justice, because my journey about social justice is about more than policy, is about more than practice. It is about more than organizing. It is about something that separates us on this earth, elevates us on this earth, connects us all, and makes it so clear that what it is we do is our peace, and how important it is to put in that peace and have faith. That if you will put in your peace, just have faith. And so I thank you for the question, because ordinarily my answer would just be about all the things that institutions can do, all institutions and the kind of programs they could do and how they could send letters to Capitol Hill and go see their senator. And yes, they can do all of that. But they are faith institutions and they are faith leaders and they're faith networks, because faith is important. And I'm happy to have those moments that Marion Wright Edelman makes me have every summer. So I get mine recharged.
Well, I would just observe that at least while Angela was talking, there were a few amen moments, right? So I'm thinking we're not that far from a faith-based institution here. The one thing I would add to this, because I want us to be able to close and mingle, is that when you think about what brings you to this work, maybe what brought you tonight, and maybe what brings you to some commitment to this work, it's generally not from the head, but from the heart. It's generally, not because you heard someone say something very smart in a class, or you read some book that really fundamentally changed you. Some of you might have. I mean, some of you may have read Capital and went, oh my God. But for the most part, it's some kind of epiphany, some kind of soul moment that makes you realize why this is your life's work, why you need to be deeply connected to it. One of the things that I suggested before is that I think that progressives, by focusing in on the structural stories and the policies and the movements, and not just also thinking about the individual stories and the individuals, kind of leave something out. And one of the reasons why we start with our own stories is how we come to doing this work. And how we come to doing this work didn't have a lot to do with, one day I was reading economics and I figured out inequality was bad. Or one day I read a little bit of a history and I realized, my God, there's been racism and it persists, right? It has to do with growing up in St. Louis and understanding how loving your parents are and how much they're trying to protect you from Jim Crow and give you the best possible life, and understanding your obligation to give that life to everybody else. They're understanding on my part that if you're the son of immigrants, you have to be paving the way, because you know that just as my dad was not able to fully realize his potential because of the racism and discrimination that he faced, because of his lack of education, how many people are we leaving behind? And what is my obligation to make sure that those doors are open for everyone? And if Stuart was here, he would tell his story, and it hasn't got a lot to do with his head. It's got a lot to do with his heart. And if we focus in on that, that is our bridge for those of us who may not go to church every Sunday, to begin to understand the power of faith-based institutions and doing that interfaith work, which is so important for racial and social justice. And thanks to the New School and to Tracyann for having us.
Thank you. I'd like to just reiterate before we end. It's a very nice place for us to end. I'd like to reiterate that their book is called Uncommon Common Ground. We have copies of the book available in the back, so please join me in thanking Angela Glover Blackwell and Manuel Proctor for joining me this evening. And let's make sure to continue the conversation.
Absolutely. Please stay and meet Angela and Manuel in person. They'll be signing books. Now you can have some food and some wine, please. And thank you all for coming. Thank you.